Hey YouTube, welcome back to Tinker with Tools. Tonight we are going to be talking about Milwaukee's brand new fuel circular saw, so let's go ahead and get into that on Tinker with Tools. Now before we get to the new saw, I do want to talk about where we came from, which is the prior generation of this saw. This is the older model now. This is the M18 fuel 6.5-inch circular saw. It is a blade left saw. We'll kind of cover that in a minute. This saw has actually been on the market since 2013. When it first came out, it was the first cordless circular saw to have a brushless motor on the market. It definitely was ahead of its time, and I think that's part of the reason why it has been able to remain for such a number of years. Now, I've actually only owned this saw for roughly 2.5 to 3 years, and I have to say, I am not disappointed in my purchase, and if I'm being completely honest, this was a revelation to me because I had never used a blade left saw before. Now, as a right-hander, I really appreciate a blade left and feel like I can get even a better quality, more accurate cut because I've got such a good line of sight to where the cut is happening. Now, I've purchased other blade left saws since then, other bigger, more powerful saws, but oftentimes I find myself coming back to this because I'm not always going to be cutting through something where all that power is necessary. This has enough power to do it. It's just no longer going to be one of the biggest and best saws on the market by any stretch of the imagination. So that is where we start to talk about the new saw. Now first, let's talk about what's the same between them. They are both going to be 6.5-inch blades. That is not the most common size blade on the market, but especially with your standard kind of construction blade, I found that the availability of blades is good enough. They are both going to have the same cut depth capacity, both at 90 and at 45 degrees. They will both bevel to 50 degrees, although we'll cover some of the finer points of that in a minute. They both have rafter hooks. Now let's start talking about what is going to be different or new about this saw. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the shoe. They are both going to be an all magnesium shoe and blade guard, but this one is actually 1.25 inches smaller in terms of overall length. Overall, this is going to feel like a smaller saw in my opinion when I'm using it, but like I said, that doesn't come without its drawback. On the front part of the saw, you do have really good visibility with its cut lines. We'll get you a close-up of that. And it is just not quite as good on the new saw. Now, all the same markings are there, but in my opinion, they're a little bit harder to read, a little bit less pronounced. They definitely have been shrunk down. That is one of the things that we'll have to see if when in use, that is something that really starts to annoy you, or if it's one of those things that you feel like would have been better with just a little bit extra length to kind of have what they had before. Now, when we start talking about what else is different when we move up to the bevel, as I mentioned, they're both going to bevel to 50 degrees, but the new saw has detents at 22.5 degrees and then at 45 as well. I think that's a nice addition to the saw. The next one is going to be what's behind here, and that is going to be, it's got a little dust ejection chute that kind of shoots the dust out the side when you're using it. And so then they also do include this vacuum port here, so you can hook it up to either a shop vac or even just dust collection and maybe contain some of that dust. Now behind here, you are going to have your depth adjustments. Although the range of depths you can adjust between are going to be the same on these saws, this one is then also going to have detents at 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, and then 1.5 inches. So it is nice to kind of have those common sizes. I think the features of adding the detents of these different saws are going to make this saw a little bit more natural to use, where you can just flip back and forth between different settings. Now, one of the last features that is going to be different is this one actually does also come with a belt hook in addition to the rafter hook up above. Now, as a more compact saw, I think this is a nice feature to add. The belt hook is just going to keep it a little bit closer to your body. Now, another area that's not as visible on the saw is going to be the performance difference. They are claiming 20% more power in this new saw, and they're claiming 40% faster cut speeds. Now, part of that cut speed improvement is they have increased the RPMs. The old saw was at 5,000 RPMs. This one goes up even further now to 6,000 RPMs. And I think when you first use it, that's one of the things that really stands out with the saw. But we'll go ahead and kind of show you exactly what we're dealing with in terms of power and performance as we do some testing right now. The one thing I do want to also do is go through a variety of batteries and kind of show you what the different cuts look like when using kind of the different Milwaukee batteries that we have, and perhaps even a battery that's not quite as topped off on its charge, just so you can kind of see how it responds and see how it acts. So let's go ahead and do the performance testing, then we'll come back for the conclusion. All right, so I've shown you the performance testing. I can tell you from using the saw that there is a pretty pronounced difference between the two saws. I actually still really like this old saw. It is going to get a new home with my brother right now, and I don't feel bad about giving him this saw by any means because it still has a lot of life in it and is still a really good saw. The new saw, however, really steps it up in power and performance, and especially on those cross cuts. The motor doesn't really seem to dip down all that much or bog down when it gets going. It almost just kind of pushes itself at the same level until it really starts to cut out. It doesn't give a lot of advanced warning or notice of when it's going to cut down, so it's not like you're getting a precursor for when you should maybe back off a little bit. There's a lot of audible feedback with this saw. You're able to kind of back off when you do hear that. This one, it might surprise you a couple of times if it does cut out. But for the most part, I've noticed that it's actually doing a pretty good job in making it through stuff. Cross cuts, never had it cut out once. It was more on some of those rip cuts where I was really trying to push it and see how much faster I could get it to go than the old saw. That's where you started to see some of the cutout. Now let's talk about the one thing that I don't feel is necessarily an improvement, and that is the amount of dust that this thing produces. This is a messy saw. I get why they gave you a vacuum port. I'll have shown you the cut with the vacuum port engaged. Without it, it just spews sawdust everywhere. If you are accustomed to standing on the left side of the cut, stand back because this thing will absolutely cover you in sawdust. Now it does a good job of ejecting the sawdust so it's not going to get clogged up in there. It just feels like a much messier saw. You'll have noticed when I show you the footage for the vacuum cut that it actually is going to show just how much sawdust is still escaping out. With that vacuum engaged, you're not getting track saw levels of dust control, nor would you expect to with how much openness is around the blade. It does actually collect quite a bit of dust and does prevent it from being ejected out off to the side, but you are still going to be dealing with dust even if you have that attached to vacuum port. Now in terms of use, as I mentioned early on, I really do prefer the old cut lines and kind of guidelines of the old saw. They're easier to read, they're a little bit nicer. This one feels like it was stripped down for, I mean, it seems like they did it so it could be a smaller, more compact saw. And I think if you are an experienced saw user, this will eventually not bother you. If you're someone who's a little bit less experienced, like I have been at times, I think the other guidelines are going to be maybe a little bit more welcome. So now let's talk about price. The new saw comes only as a bare tool for $229. There is no kitted option, so you're not going to have to try and decide between doing the kit or the bare tool. I could see this being included in future promotions where this would be one of the bare tools. If you buy a battery promotion or if you buy 2 bare tools, you get a battery pack with it. That is something that I could see this being offered in the near future. Potentially even this holiday season, I could see them including this saw as part of those promotions. But as far as right now, it is only tool only. I have seen this other saw for $219 at my local Home Depot. There was one store that had it clearanced out a little bit more. I just don't know if for the 6.5 inch, the old vert model, I don't think a $10 price cut is enough to make me want to buy that one over this saw. If it was half off or something, I could see someone rationalizing that because in my opinion, this is going to be an improvement over any of their other non-fuel circular saws. And so if you see a screaming deal on it, it's not a bad saw to buy. It's just not going to be worth it at that $10 price difference. When it comes to how it compares to the 7 1/4, for me and the work that I do, I'm not ever going to be going and buying that 7 1/4 blade right because I just don't, one, prefer the blade right circular saw, and it's not like I'm getting so much more capacity with the saw. Was that saw more powerful than the old one? Yes. Is it potentially still more powerful than this? Possibly so, but this one is plenty powerful for the work that I do. It is a nice step up in power, and it is 3 pounds lighter roughly than that bigger 7 1/4 saw. So for those reasons, even at $30 price savings, I still don't think I'd be enticed to go with the 7 1/4, but it also makes me wonder if we're not going to see a new 7 1/4 blade right saw coming out as perhaps pipeline next week because they're putting that saw on such a discounted price. It normally is about $249, so seeing a $50 price cut is a pretty substantial one. Makes me wonder what we're going to see with that saw. All right, so there you have it. If you have any questions about the new saw, go ahead and leave them in the comments down below. Let me know if you have some saws that you'd like to see this tested against. I've had one person request a rigid. I'm sure DeWalt is going to come up at some point, but if you have one that you really like to see tested, go ahead and let me know and we'll see if we can make it happen. If you like this video, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. Make sure to turn on notifications if you do so you get notified when I put out a new video. And as always, thank you for all the support. And until next time, I'll catch you on Tinker with Tools.